Muddy boot prints on my porch. That's how it started. Not a letter, not a polite knock, but Greg, from the HOA, trespassing to stare at my private well. He thought he could take my family's water to fill their sterile community pool. He had no idea what was coming. Cold. That is the very first thing you notice about the water from the deep aquifers beneath my property. It isn't the refreshing, polite chill of a refrigerator dispenser. It is an ancient, teeth-aching cold that tastes faintly of iron, wet limestone, and crushed flint. When you pump it straight from the ground, the pipe sweats instantly in the summer heat, condensation dripping onto the dry dirt before you can even bring the glass to your lips. My grandfather drove that well in 1968. He was a man who smelled perpetually of sawdust and cheap tobacco, and he bought this 2-acre plot when it was nothing but scrub brush and county road. He built the house with his own hands, drove the pipe 60 feet down into the bedrock, and tapped into a subterranean spring, so pure and pressurized, it practically pushed the water up the shaft to greet him. I inherited the property a decade ago. I kept the old cast-iron pump out back, primarily for sentimental reasons, though it was fully functional and connected to the main plumbing through a heavily modified, perfectly legal bypass valve. Over the years, the county road paved itself over. The scrub brush was bulldozed. Developers bought the surrounding farmland, carved it into quarter-acre lots, and built Pelican Ridge, a sprawling cookie-cutter subdivision where every house was painted, one of 3 approved shades of grayish. Because my grandfather's deed predated the development by 40 years, my property was a jagged, irregular cutout right in the middle of their master plan. I was legally grandfathered into the neighborhood, an island of overgrown oak trees and peeling blue paint, surrounded by meticulously manicured Bermuda grass and white vinyl fencing. I ignored them. They ignored me until the drought hit. It was mid-July, and the sky had been the color of an old bruise for weeks, a hazy, suffocating gray that trapped the heat but refused to yield a single drop of rain. The local reservoir dropped dangerously low. The city imposed strict watering bans. Suddenly, the lush emerald lawns of Pelican Ridge began to crisp and turn a sickly, pale yellow. The community's crown jewel, a massive resort-style pool and a heavily irrigated 3-hole pitch and putt golf course, was in jeopardy. That was when I found the notice. It wasn't a formal letter sent through the mail. It was a piece of neon yellow printer paper, the kind you buy at a dollar store, aggressively taped to my front door with packing tape. The tape was already peeling at the edges, leaving a sticky, gummy residue on my faded wood. I remember peeling it off, the sound a loud, tearing rasp in the quiet afternoon. My hands were dirty from repotting tomatoes, dirt caked deep under my fingernails, and I left a brown thumbprint on the paper as I read it. Notice of resource reallocation by order of the Pelican Ridge Homeowners Association, Board of Directors, effective immediately. All subterranean water assets within the community perimeter are hereby claimed under the Emergency Drought Mitigation Clause, Section 4, Paragraph 12b. Access to private wells must be surrendered to the HOA maintenance team by Friday to facilitate community resource distribution. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $500. I stood there on my porch, the dry wind rattling the dead wind chimes above my head. My initial reaction wasn't anger. I didn't clench my fists or vow heroic revenge. I felt a cold, oily slick of panic pool in my stomach. I am not a confrontational man. I am an accountant. I spend my days looking at spreadsheets, perfectly content in the silence of my home office, listening to the soft hum of my computer fan. The thought of fighting a board of angry, litigious neighbors made my mouth go dry. My heart hammered against my ribs, a chaotic, panicked rhythm, and my palms began to sweat. I looked out past my overgrown property line. Standing on the sidewalk, just beyond my old chain-link fence, was Greg. Greg was the HOA president. He was a man who seemed entirely constructed of pastel golf shirts, khaki shorts, and unearned confidence. He was standing there with his hands on his hips, wearing mirrored sunglasses that reflected the harsh afternoon sun. Even from 40 feet away, I could imagine the smell of his synthetic cedar cologne. He wasn't looking at my house. He was looking at the old cast-iron pump in my side yard. He gave me a stiff, two-finger wave, a gesture so dripping with smug authority, it finally pierced through my anxiety and struck the bedrock of my pride. He thought I would just roll over. He thought I was just some weird hermit in the old house who would hand over my family's legacy because he printed a scary-sounding warning. I didn't wave back. I crumpled the yellow paper in my fist, the sharp edges digging into my palm, and walked back inside. The screen door slammed shut behind me, the loud crack echoing through the empty house. I turned on my kitchen faucet. The water ran cold, clear, and steady. I filled a glass, the icy water jarring my teeth as I drank it down. They weren't taking it. The Pelican Ridge clubhouse was a monument to cheap modern luxury. It smelled intensely of off-gassing carpet adhesive, chlorine from the indoor hot tub, and a cloying vanilla air freshener plugged into every available outlet. The lighting was painfully bright, bouncing off the polished faux wood floors and settling on the faces of 50 irritated residents. I arrived 10 minutes late to the emergency board meeting. I hadn't planned a grand entrance. I just spent 15 minutes sitting in my driveway inside my 2012 Honda, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles ached, trying to convince my lungs to take in enough oxygen. My car smelled faintly of old French fries and damp upholstery, a familiar, comforting scent that I desperately wanted to stay wrapped in. But I forced myself out. When I pushed open the double glass doors of the clubhouse, the low murmur of conversation snapped into a suffocating silence. Heads turned, eyes dragged up and down my faded jeans and plain gray t-shirt. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck. I could feel the sweat pooling at the small of my back, sticky and uncomfortable. At the front of the room, sitting behind a long folding table draped in a cheap blue plastic tablecloth, was Greg. Flanking him were two other board members. Brenda, a woman with tight, helmet-like hair who was aggressively taking notes on an iPad, and a man whose name I didn't know, who was rhythmically chewing gum with his mouth open. "Ah," Greg said, his voice amplified by a surprisingly loud microphone. "Our neighbor from the annex. Glad you could make it. Have a seat." He pointed to a single empty folding chair in the front row. I hated that walk. The squeak of my sneakers on the floor sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. I sat down. The chair wobbled. "Let's get right to it," Greg announced, leaning into the microphone. He clicked his pen. Click, clack. The sound was sharp, metallic. "As you all know, the city has threatened to fine the HOA if we continue watering the greens. But if we lose the greens, our property values plummet. We all suffer. Fortunately, our legal charter has a contingency for this." He projected a slide onto the wall behind him. It was a dense wall of text. When this community was chartered, a clause was included regarding shared subterranean assets. It was designed for mineral rights, but legally, water is a mineral. Greg smiled, a thin, bloodless stretching of his lips. He looked directly at me. "We have a massive, untapped aquifer sitting right in the middle of our community. A resource that is currently being hoarded by a single residence." A low grumble moved through the crowd. I felt the weight of 50 glares pressing into the back of my neck. My throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. "I don't live in your community," I said. My voice cracked. It wasn't loud enough. I cleared my throat, tasting a bitter, metallic tang of pure adrenaline. I said, "My property isn't part of Pelican Ridge. Your charter doesn't apply to my land." Brenda stopped typing on her iPad. She looked over her reading glasses. "Actually, your grandfather signed a reciprocal easement agreement in 1999 to use our access road. In doing so, he legally bound your parcel to the overarching bylaws of the master planned community. It's in the county records." My stomach plummeted, hitting the floor with a sickening thud. A reciprocal easement? I had no idea what that meant. I remembered the developers paving the dirt road in front of my house. I remembered my grandfather grumbling about paperwork. Had he signed away our rights just to use a paved driveway? "We already have a contractor ready," Greg continued smoothly, ignoring my rising panic. "They'll be trenching a line from your wellhead to our main irrigation pump on Friday morning. We will install a meter to ensure you still have enough water for standard domestic use. Showers, drinking, but the excess belongs to the community. You can't do that, I stammered. I sounded weak. I hated how small my voice was in this cavernous, vanilla-scented room. It's my water. It's community water, Greg corrected, leaning forward. The microphone squealed with feedback. And if you obstruct the contractors, we will enforce the $500 daily fine. Once those fines hit $5,000, we put a lien on your house. We will foreclose on you, take the property, and pull the water anyway. I suggest you leave the gate unlocked. I looked around at the faces behind me. I expected to see at least one sympathetic look. Instead, I saw apathy. I saw one man scrolling on his phone, entirely disengaged. I saw a woman eating noisy roasted almonds from a plastic bag. They didn't care about my grandfather's well, or my rights, or the theft about to take place. They just wanted their golf course to stay green so their house appraisals wouldn't drop a fraction of a percent. I didn't have a witty retort. I didn't slam my fist on the table or deliver a devastating monologue. I just stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, and walked out. I practically sprinted to my car. When I finally shut the car door, sealing myself in the quiet, dim interior, my hands were shaking so violently I couldn't get the key into the ignition. The metal scratched against the plastic steering column. I let my head fall forward against the wheel. The horn gave a pathetic, muffled beep. I sat there and cried, not loud sobbing, but hot, angry tears of sheer impotence that burned the corners of my eyes. I was terrified. I was going to lose my grandfather's house over a patch of dying grass. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, bathed in the harsh, blue light of my laptop monitor, sifting through endless pages of legalese. By 3 a.m., my eyelids felt like they were lined with crushed glass, and a dull, throbbing headache had anchored itself right behind my temples. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, leaving a dark, bitter ring against the ceramic. I was looking for a loophole, defense, anything. Every forum post I read told me the same thing. HOA boards have terrifying power. If there was an easement, if my grandfather had signed something linking our properties, they really could fine me into foreclosure. I needed a lawyer. But I didn't need a slick, billboard lawyer smiling from a bus stop. I needed someone who understood dirt, water, and obscure county records. At 4:15 a.m., I found a rudimentary website that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2004. The background was plain gray. The text was Times New Roman, and there were no photos. It just said, Mitchell Davies, Property, Mineral, and Water Rights Law. The address was an hour away, in the decaying downtown district of the next county over. I called his office at exactly 8:01 a.m. A woman with a raspy voice told me to come in at noon. Mitchell Davies's office was on the third floor of a brutalist concrete building that looked like a Cold War bunker. The elevator was broken, so I climbed 3 flights of stairs that smelled faintly of ammonia and damp concrete. When I pushed open the frosted glass door to his suite, the smell changed to ozone from a churning Xerox machine and the sharp mint scent of discarded peppermint wrappers. The waiting room was empty. The receptionist pointed to a back door. Mitchell Davies was a man who looked like he had been left out in the sun too long. He was rail thin, wearing a rumpled gray suit jacket over a faded plaid shirt. He was sitting behind a desk piled so high with manila folders, it looked like a structural hazard. When I walked in, he didn't look up. He was halfway through eating a sad, flattened tuna salad sandwich on wheat bread, staring intently at a thick legal tome. "Sit," he rasped, coughing slightly. He didn't offer to shake my hand. I sat in a cracked leather chair that hissed as it released air beneath me. I opened my briefcase, my hand still trembling slightly from exhaustion and leftover anxiety. "An HOA is trying to seize my well," I said. My voice was hoarse. I pulled out the yellow notice and slid it across the desk. Mitchell chewed slowly. He wiped a crumb from his chin, finally glancing at the yellow paper. He read it without touching it. Then he looked at me. His eyes were pale gray, sharp, and entirely unsympathetic. "Are you inside their perimeter?" he asked. "I'm an out parcel," I explained. "My grandfather bought the land in '68. The subdivision was built around us in the 2000s. "Do you have the original deed?" I reached into my bag and pulled out the large, heavy envelope I had retrieved from my fire safe. I slid the brittle, yellowed paper across the desk. The crisp crinkle of the old paper sounded incredibly loud in the quiet office. Mitchell picked it up. His fingers were heavily calloused, ink stained at the tips. He traced the faded typewriter ink, his eyes scanning the metes and bounds. They claim my grandfather signed a reciprocal easement in '99 to use the paved access road, I said, my voice speeding up, the panic bleeding back in. They say it bound me to their bylaws. They're going to trench my yard on Friday. They're going to fine me $500 a day until I lose the house. Mitchell stopped reading. He closed his eyes for a second, sighed deeply, and tossed the deed onto the desk. He leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest. HOAs, Mitchell muttered, the word sounding like a curse. He picked up a sandwich, took a small bite, and chewed. I sat there in agony, watching him. Did your grandfather sign an easement? He finally asked. I don't know, I admitted, feeling entirely foolish. Probably. The road was paved. We use it. Mitchell let out a dry, hacking laugh. It wasn't a friendly sound. It was the sound of a man who found the sheer stupidity of the world amusing. Mr. Davies? I prompted. They're idiots, Mitchell said flatly. He leaned forward, sweeping a pile of junk mail out of the way to make room on his desk. These petty dictators read one line in a community charter and think they have eminent domain. Let me explain something to you about water rights in this state. He grabbed a thick black marker and a legal pad. We operate under a hybrid system of prior appropriation and absolute ownership of groundwater, Mitchell said, drawing a crude diagram of a house and a well. Rule of capture says whoever pumps it owns it, so long as it's not malicious. But more importantly, water rights can be severed from surface rights. When your grandfather drove that well in 1968, he established a beneficial use right that predates their subdivision by 3 decades. But the easement, I started. An easement for ingress and egress using a road does not surrender severable mineral or water rights. Mitchell cut me off, his voice suddenly sharp, commanding, unless your grandfather explicitly signed a deed conveying the water rights to the HOA, which he didn't, because developers in '99 didn't give a damn about your well when they had city water. They are bluffing. They're bringing a trenching machine on Friday, I said softly. Mitchell smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory smile that crinkled the leathery skin around his eyes. Could let them bring it. He tossed the marker onto the desk. My retainer is $5,000. I bill $300 an hour. This will likely end in an emergency injunction and a lawsuit for trespass, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. $5,000. It was nearly all I had in my emergency savings. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Was it worth it? Could I just let them take the water? The meter meant I'd still have enough to drink. It would be so much easier to just surrender. I wouldn't have to fight. I wouldn't have to face Greg's smug smile or the hostile stares of 50 neighbors. But then I remembered the cold, iron taste of the water. I remembered my grandfather's calloused hands wrapping around the cast iron pump handle. And I remembered Greg standing on the sidewalk, treating my home like a supply closet for his golf course. A sudden, unfamiliar spike of pure spite pierced through my anxiety. Do it, I said, reaching for my checkbook. Sleep abandoned me completely on Thursday night. I spent the hours between midnight and dawn, lying flat on my back on the living room rug, staring up at the popcorn ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, my brain helpfully projected a high-definition montage of my impending financial ruin. I mentally tallied my remaining bank balance, subtracting Mitchell Davies's retainer, calculating how many months of mortgage I had left before the money evaporated entirely. My stomach churned a toxic mixture of black coffee and sheer dread. I felt ridiculous. I am a grown man, an accountant who analyzes risk for a living, yet I was hiding in my own house like a rabbit waiting for the hounds. I wanted to call Mitchell. I wanted to cancel the check, apologize to Greg, and let them take the damn water. It would be so simple to just give up. Giving up is quiet. Fighting is loud, expensive, and nauseating. By 6:30 a.m., the summer sun was already baking the dew off the overgrown crabgrass in my front yard. The air inside the house felt thick and heavy. At 6:45 a.m., the hounds arrived. It started with a low, bone-rattling vibration that bled through the floorboards. Then came the unmistakable, guttural roar of heavy diesel engines. I stood up, my knees popping in the quiet house, and walked to the front window. I pulled the faded floral curtain back just an inch. A massive white Ford F-350 with dual rear wheels was backing onto the paved access road that bordered my property. Attached to the truck was a heavy-duty flatbed trailer. Sitting on the trailer, gleaming in obnoxious, factory-fresh yellow paint, was a ditch witch trencher. It looked like a mechanical insect, all hydraulic hoses, thick rubber treads, and a terrifying chainsaw-like blade designed to chew through rock and soil. The truck hissed as the driver engaged the air brakes. Two men in scuffed work boots, faded denim, and sweat-stained t-shirts climbed out of the cab. They moved with the slow, methodical lethargy of men who were paid by the hour. Then a golf cart zipped down the sidewalk. Greg stepped out. He was wearing khaki golf pants, white sneakers, and, absurdly, a neon orange high-visibility safety vest over his pastel blue polo shirt. He held a clipboard pressed against his chest. He looked like a child playing construction foreman. I watched as Greg pointed excitedly toward the edge of my property line, tracing a path through the air that led directly to my grandfather's cast-iron well pump. He was smiling. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked into my throat. My hands began to shake again. I looked at the kitchen clock. It was 6:52 a.m. I grabbed my cell phone. Mitchell had given me his direct cell number, written in blue ink on the back of a business card. I dialed it. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. "This is Davies. Leave it." I hung up. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the heavy clanking of heavy metal chains being unfastened from the trailer outside. Thump, clang. They were lowering the ramps. I had 2 choices. I could lock the deadbolt, hide in the bathroom, and let them tear up 70 feet of my property while I hyperventilated into a towel. Or I could walk out there. I looked down at my hands. They were pale, the fingernails chewed down to the quick. I remembered my grandfather's hands, thick, rough, smelling of earth and oil. He hadn't driven 60 feet of steel pipe through solid bedrock just so a guy in a bright orange vest could steal his water to keep a pitch and putt green looking nice. I opened the front door. The hinges shrieked. The heat hit me instantly, carrying the smell of exhaust fumes, crushed wet grass, and hot asphalt. I walked down the concrete steps. My legs felt like they were made of damp sand. Every step required a conscious command from my brain. As I approached the chain-link fence, the contractor was already firing up the trencher. The engine caught with a deafening, rattling cough, belching a cloud of blue smoke into the humid air. The machine idled, a deep, mechanical thumping that vibrated in my chest cavity. "Hey!" I yelled. My voice cracked. It was pathetic. I cleared my throat, forcing air up from my diaphragm. "Hey, shut it off!" The contractor operating the machine looked at me, squinting through the smoke. He didn't turn it off, but he throttled it down. The rattling quieted slightly. Greg marched over to the fence line. He adjusted his mirrored sunglasses, his jaw set in a hard, authoritative line. "Good morning," Greg shouted over the idling engine. "I hope you got our notice. We're executing the resource reallocation today. Please step back from the perimeter. It's a liability issue." "You don't have the right to dig on my land," I said. I grabbed the cold galvanized steel of the chain-link gate. My knuckles were white. "This is private property. We've been over this," Greg sighed, using the tone of a tired kindergarten teacher explaining a simple rule. "The reciprocal easement grants the association access for utility maintenance and emergency resource management. Now please go back inside." He turned to the contractor. "Go ahead, Mike. Start at the edge of the asphalt and cut straight towards that rusted pump." Mike, the contractor, looked at me. He looked at Greg. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Listen, buddy," Mike said to me, his voice gravelly. "I just got a work order. HOA says they got the easement. I don't want any trouble. If you cross that property line is trespassing," I said to Mike. I tried to sound firm, but I was sweating profusely, my gray t-shirt clinging to my chest. "I will call the police." Greg laughed, a short, dismissive bark. "Call them. We have the charter right here." He tapped his clipboard. They won't get involved in a civil dispute. Mike, drop the blade. Mike reached for the hydraulic lever. The massive, steel-toothed chain on the front of the trencher began to rotate slowly, a terrifying metal-on-metal scraping sound. He pushed the drive lever forward. The machine lurched off the asphalt and onto the dying yellow grass at the edge of my property line. The heavy rubber treads crushed the dry soil. I couldn't breathe. I was completely paralyzed. The machine was 5 feet away, then 3. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the sound of tearing earth. A long, aggressive blast from a car horn shattered the morning air. I opened my eyes. A rusted, forest green 1994 Mercury Grand Marquis had just careened around the corner of the access road. It didn't slow down. It jumped the curb, its heavy shocks bottoming out with a loud, metallic crunch, and slammed to a halt directly in the path of the trenching machine. The front bumper of the Mercury was less than 6 inches from the spinning steel teeth of the trencher. Mike slammed the hydraulic levers backward. The trencher jerked to a violent stop, the engine stalling out with a loud chug-chug hiss. Silence descended on the yard, thick and ringing. The driver's side door of the Mercury groaned open. Out stepped Mitchell Davies. He looked even worse in the daylight. His gray suit jacket was deeply wrinkled. He was wearing a faded red tie that had a coffee stain near the knot, and he had a half-chewed, unlit cigar clamped in the corner of his mouth. He was holding a thick manila envelope. He didn't rush. He shut his car door with a heavy thud, walked to the front of his vehicle, and looked at the trencher. He reached out and tapped the steel blade with his knuckle. "You scratch my paint with this thing, Mike," Mitchell rasped, his voice cutting through the humid silence like a rusty saw. "And I'm going to own your truck, your tools, and your house." Greg was practically vibrating with rage. He marched past the stalled trencher, his high-vis vest reflecting the morning sun. "Who the hell are you?" Greg demanded, pointing a finger at Mitchell. "You just drove your vehicle onto a pedestrian walkway. Move that piece of junk immediately, or I'm having it towed." Mitchell slowly turned his head. He didn't take his hands out of his jacket pockets. He looked Greg up and down, his pale gray eyes resting briefly on the bright orange safety vest. A slow, mocking smile pulled at the corners of his mouth. "Are you directing traffic today, or just playing dress-up?" Mitchell asked. Greg's face flushed a deep, violent crimson. "I am the president of the Pelican Ridge Homeowners Association. We are executing a legal utility easement. You are interfering with contracted work." "No," Mitchell said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. "I am interfering with a felony." Mitchell pulled a thick stack of stapled papers from the manila envelope. He walked past Greg, completely ignoring him, and stepped right up to Mike, the contractor, who was still standing behind the controls of the trencher. "You the owner of the LLC?" Mitchell asked Mike. Yeah, Mike's trenching and irrigation," the contractor stammered, taking a half-step backward. Mitchell thrust a copy of the papers against Mike's chest. Instinctively, Mike took them. "That," Mitchell said, pointing a stained, calloused finger at the document, "is a temporary restraining order. It was signed at 6:15 this morning by Judge Harrison over in county court. It specifically enjoins Pelican Ridge HOA, its board members, and any contracted agents, that's you, Mike, from stepping foot on this property." Mike stared at the paper. The blue ink of the judge's signature stood out starkly against the black text. I just got a work order," Mike repeated, looking desperate. "I don't know anything about this." "Ignorance isn't a defense against civil trespass or conversion of mineral rights," Mitchell stated, his tone suddenly shifting from mocking to purely analytical, dripping with legal authority. "If you turn that machine back on, if one of those teeth scratches the dirt on my client's parcel, I will file a tort claim against your LLC before lunch. I will drag you into litigation for 3 years. Your legal fees will bankrupt you before we even get to discovery. Back that machine up onto your trailer, Mike, now." Mike didn't hesitate. He tossed the TRO onto the seat of the trencher, jumped onto the controls, and immediately began reversing the machine away from my property line. "Hey!" Greg yelled, spinning around. "Stop! You are under contract with the HOA. We are paying you. You ain't paying me enough to get sued by a guy who looks like he sleeps in a courthouse. Mike yelled back, over the rumble of the restarting engine. He expertly maneuvered the trencher backward toward the flatbed trailer. Greg turned back to Mitchell, his chest heaving. The smug, unearned confidence had evaporated, replaced by the panicked aggression of a cornered animal. "This is a delay tactic," Greg sneered. "We have a reciprocal easement. It's in the county records. The HOA has authority over overarching utility infrastructure." Mitchell finally turned his full attention to Greg. He pulled a second copy of the TRO from his envelope, but he didn't hand it over. He held it up. "You see, Greg," Mitchell said, pronouncing the name with deliberate disrespect, "you made a very common, very stupid mistake. You read a real estate document without understanding property law. An easement for ingress and egress, the right to use a paved road, does not constitute a severance of subterranean mineral rights." "Water isn't a mineral," Greg barked. "Under the state water code, groundwater is governed by the rule of capture," Mitchell continued, his voice echoing slightly against the aluminum siding of my house. He was lecturing now, and he clearly enjoyed it. "My client's grandfather drove that well. He established beneficial use. Those rights run with the land. They were never severed, and they were certainly never transferred to a glorified lawn care committee." Mitchell stepped closer to Greg. The height difference wasn't much, but Mitchell's presence was suffocating. "What you attempted today," Mitchell said softly, "was the illegal seizure of a private utility. That's conversion. That's a tort, legal notice of intent. Furthermore, be advised that any further attempts to access, alter, or seize the private well located on the aforementioned parcel will result in immediate civil action. We will seek punitive damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress, harassment, and gross negligence." Mitchell quoted the document from memory, tapping the paper. "That means, Greg, that when I sue you, I'm not just suing the HOA's insurance policy. I am piercing the corporate veil. I am suing you, personally, for acting outside the scope of your fiduciary duties. I'm going to sue Brenda. I'm going to sue the guy who chews gum. I'm going to attach liens to your personal homes to satisfy the judgment." He realized in real time the catastrophic depth of his miscalculation. He had risked his personal home to save a golf course green. You can't do that," Greg whispered, his voice stripped of all authority. "I can," Mitchell replied, finally taking the unlit cigar out of his mouth. "And I will enjoy it. You have exactly 10 seconds to get off my client's property line before I call the sheriff and have you arrested for criminal trespass." Greg looked down at his clipboard. He looked at the heavy rubber tread marks the trencher had left on the dying grass just inches from my property line. He didn't say another word. He turned on his heel, walked stiffly back to his golf cart, and drove away. He didn't look back. I stood at the fence, my heart hammering against my ribs, an overwhelming wave of exhaustion crashing over me. The adrenaline was leaving my system, leaving me hollow and shaking. Mitchell walked over to my fence. He leaned against the metal post, pulling a crinkled roll of peppermint antacids from his pocket. He popped one into his mouth and crunched it loudly. 20 minutes, Mitchell said, looking at his gold wristwatch. "Not bad." "Thank you," I breathed. It felt entirely inadequate. I thought they were going to do it. I thought I was going to lose it." Mitchell shrugged, looking out over my overgrown, chaotic yard. He looked at the old cast-iron pump. "Bullies only understand one language," Mitchell said, turning back toward his battered Mercury. "And it isn't reason. It's leverage. You have the water. They don't. Keep your gate locked. If they send another letter, frame it." He got into his car. The engine struggled to turn over, finally catching with a roar of terrible exhaust. I was alone again. I walked to the back of my yard, my sneakers crunching softly against the dry dirt. I stopped in front of the well pump. The cast iron was warm from the morning sun, rough and textured under my fingertips. I grabbed the heavy iron handle and pushed it down. It resisted for a moment, the ancient leather gaskets groaning, and then the water came. It gushed out of the spout, splashing violently against the concrete basin. I cupped my hands and caught the heavy flow. I brought it to my face and drank. It was perfect, freezing cold, tasting faintly of iron, wet limestone, and deep earth. It was a taste older than the subdivision, older than the HOA, older than Greg and his bright orange vest. Over the next few weeks, the drought deepened. The city banned all outdoor watering. From my front porch, I watched Pelican Ridge slowly die. The lush Bermuda grass faded to a sickly yellow, then curled into a brittle, burnt brown. The three-hole golf course turned to dust. The property values dipped, just as they feared. I didn't gloat. There was no grand celebration. My victory felt strangely isolating. When I drove my car down the access road, my neighbors looked at me differently. Before, I was just the weird guy in the old house. Now I was the enemy. I was the man who hoarded the water while their lawns burned. I saw the hostility in the tight lines of their mouths, in the way they turned their backs when I drove past. But I didn't care anymore. The knot of anxiety that had lived in my stomach for a decade was gone, washed away by the icy water of a deep aquifer. I had stood on the edge of the trench, and I hadn't fallen in. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cicadas began their rhythmic buzzing, I walked out to the side yard. I listened to the sounds of the neighborhood, the hum of air conditioners, the distant slam of a car door, and then I pumped the handle. I listened to the deep, subterranean gurgle of the water rushing up from the dark, hitting the metal pipe, steady and unbroken. A vein in the stone, pulsing right beneath my feet, belonging to no one but me. Cold, iron-rich water tastes best when you know you fought tooth and nail to keep it. Those board members thought they could steamroll a quiet guy just to keep their golf greens pristine, but they choked on their own arrogance instead. If you've ever felt the pure, cynical satisfaction of watching a neighborhood tyrant back down, hit that like button. Share this video with anyone dealing with an overstepping board, and subscribe for more stories of hard-fought justice.